Hey everyone, it's Nikki. Today I wanted to talk to you about one of the easiest ways to improve your photography, not using auto mode. Now, I know basically everyone and their mom who has a photography blog or whatever has told you to do that, but going straight from full auto to full manual is a bit daunting. So here's a sort of chronology to help you to get used to using the manual functions of your camera. Let's get started. Number 1, get a camera with manual mode. Obviously, in order to use manual mode, your camera has to have it available as an option. Odds are your camera has manual mode. These days, most DSLRs, mirrorless cameras, and even higher-end point-and-shoots like the Sony RX100 or the Canon G7X have a manual mode. If you don't have a camera with those capabilities, now it's time to upgrade. For this video, I'll be using my Canon T3i and my 18 to 55mm kit lens in order to illustrate that you don't need a souped-up camera or an expensive lens to take decent shots. You may want those things down the line in order to make your life easier, but the camera does not make the photographer. Number 2, turn off flash. This is a simple step. If your camera has an auto mode without flash, turn that off. Unless you know what you're doing with flash, 90% of the time, the photo you're trying to take with the built-in flash will look better without it. Number 3, study the exposure triangle and white balance. This is crucial to understanding photography. The exposure triangle is composed of ISO, shutter speed, and aperture. ISO is the sensor's sensitivity to light, aperture is how open the pupil of your camera's lens is, and the shutter speed is how fast the camera takes the photo. Understanding how these three elements interact and affect stylistic aspects of photography such as motion blur and depth of field is crucial to properly exposing photos in manual mode. White balance is another incredibly important aspect of photography. It affects the coloration of the image. If your photos look too blue or too orange, it's likely that you have the wrong white balance set up for your particular shot. Barry Carroll wrote what I consider a pretty comprehensive guide to the exposure triangle, which I'll link down below. For more information on white balance, you can also check out the blog post by John Bosley that I've linked down in the description. Number 4, use Program Auto. Program Auto is the first step in this process where you, the photographer, are going to be messing around with some manual features. Program Auto automatically sets the aperture and shutter speed while letting you mess around with stuff like ISO, white balance, flash, and exposure compensation. Exposure compensation makes a photo brighter or darker, usually by changing the shutter speed. On Canon, the further to the right that the stop on the light meter is, positive numbers, makes the photo brighter, and vice versa. I know Nikon is the opposite, left is positive numbers, right is negative numbers, but I can't speak for other brands like Panasonic and Sony. Program Auto is also a good setting to use if you're trying to take photos quickly without worrying about them being exposed properly. Most of the time anyway. Number 5, use shutter or aperture priority. This is a step where I was stuck for a long time. Aperture and shutter priority are essentially the same as Program Auto, except you can modify whichever setting you have set as a priority. The camera automatically sets the other feature to properly expose the photo. You can also use exposure compensation in these modes. In aperture priority, it changes the shutter speed, and in shutter priority, it changes the aperture. Using aperture versus shutter priority is a matter of personal taste, as well as dependent on what style of photography you're doing. I typically use aperture priority in order to get the depth of field I want, since I mostly photograph toys and nature. But if you're doing something like sports or animals, you might want to use shutter priority in order to make sure that your subject won't be blurry. Number 6, use full manual. We made it! In full manual, you adjust all 3 aspects of the exposure triangle, as well as other settings like white balance and flash. But wait! How do I make sure the photo is exposed properly if the camera doesn't do it for me? This was the reason I was hesitant to use full manual for so long. Turns out, it's super easy. Just like with exposure compensation, you look at the light meter to make sure it's set at 0. If it's not, adjust the ISO, shutter speed, and aperture until it is. If the photo still comes out looking a bit under or overexposed, try bumping it up or taking it down a stop to see if that helps. Just like in Program Auto and aperture or shutter priority, sometimes the camera will think a photo is properly exposed, even if it's not matching what you see. If your camera continuously thinks that your photos are properly exposed when they clearly aren't, you might be using the wrong metering mode. Courtney Slaznick wrote a great blog post on this that I will link down in the description. I typically adjust the ISO first, then the shutter speed, trying to keep my aperture as low as possible. However, if you're shooting handheld, make sure you don't set the shutter speed too low, otherwise you'll get a ton of camera shake, and possibly motion blur, which you may or may not want. That's a lot to take in, especially if you're holding your brand new camera with all these features for the first time. Here's a quick recap. 1, get a camera with manual mode. Duh. 2, if your camera has an auto without flash mode, enable that. 3, understand how the exposure triangle and white balance work. 4, try your hand at Program Auto, utilizing ISO, white balance, and exposure compensation. 5. Once you're comfortable with program auto, try using aperture or shutter priority. Find out which situations benefit best from which setting. And 6. Take the plunge and try full manual. One thing I want to mention before I sign off is that a lot of photographers dogmatically enforce using full manual in all situations, which is something I don't particularly agree with. You definitely have the most control with full manual, but in some situations, you might want to utilize some of the automatic features of your camera. As technology gets better and better, the camera's ability to accurately assess its surroundings also gets better. One feature my RS100 has that I really love is its auto ISO feature, that allows you to set a minimum and maximum ISO. This allows you to futz with the shutter speed and aperture without having to worry about the ISO, and not having to worry about your photo being too noisy with a higher ISO than you'd like. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!